Hi everyone, good afternoon. We are about to get started with part 2 of the Eureka Remediation webinar. Thanks so much to see many familiar names in the chat. If you are just joining us, please make sure that your phone is muted. Thanks so much. If you were with us on Monday, we spent a great time together going through part 1. If you were not able to make it on Monday, the meeting unfortunately did not get recorded on Monday, and so I will be doing a re-recording so that that can be posted because I know many of you are re-delivering this content to your school. So I plan to do that re-recording as soon as possible so that we can get these materials, and they will be available on the Louisiana Department of Education YouTube channel. As we get started today, before I share our agenda for the session so that you know where we're headed, we're going to start with a short warm-up activity. So in the chat box, if you would please share, how does remediation and intervention happen in your classroom or at your school? So I think we may hear some about small groups or centers or a separate intervention time, but it'll be good to get a sense of how that's looking in schools across the state. Let's take a few minutes to enter that into the chat box. So I'm seeing a lot of different types of intervention structures, and that's one area that I hope throughout the webinar today we can keep sharing ideas in the chat box of ways to provide remediation and intervention at our campuses, because I know we're all going to learn a lot from the ways that we do it across different schools. As a reminder, if you were here on Monday, you saw these before, but these are our objectives for the two-part webinar series. So we're going to learn how the Eureka Remediation Tools can help you diagnose critical foundational skills and plan how and when to address unfinished learning. On Monday, we did an overview of the tools, we practiced analyzing student work, and we began to identify the remediation materials. Today, we are going to revisit those remediation materials to actually talk about which portions we would use. And we're going to talk about when can remediation happen, both within the module unit and within our school schedule. And we'll wrap up with some Q&A, both some questions that were submitted on Monday as well as anything else that occurs today. Here's our agenda for today. We'll start with a very quick recap of Webinar 1, and then we'll be doing lots of practice. So we will look at the linked remediation lesson. We'll talk about when to do the remediation within our unit and when during the school day. And then we'll close with some Q&A. If you're joining us today, the Eureka Remediation Tools, this is a new resource. They are available for grades 4 through 8 in Algebra 1. They include diagnostic questions on prior grade level standards that are connected to the new content within the module. They link to prior grade level lessons to target the unfinished learning, and they're designed to be used in the core math class, an intervention time, RTI time, or a combination. Linked in the webinar, I have a few of the materials that we looked at on Monday, so you don't need to pull these up now unless you're curious and you want to look at them, but I do want to just make sure that you know that they are available. On Monday, we looked at the Eureka Remediation Introduction that showed us all the topics that will have a diagnostic release this year. So if you see a module and topic listed under your grade level, the state is creating a diagnostic and remediation tool. The check mark means that that is currently posted on the State Department website and ready to use in your classroom. If it does not have a check mark, they are being posted on a rolling basis this fall. We looked specifically on Monday at a grade 8 example. So we explored together grade 8 module 1 topic A, and we used this tool to first understand what skills and knowledge students were learning in this topic and what foundational skills were needed. And those are displayed on the screen as a refresher for those of us that were here, and if you weren't here, so you can get a sense. So I'm going to pause for just a few seconds for you to read at the screen. So we know this topic is all about expressions and exponents. Students are going to be doing a lot with integer exponents and learning the rules related to positive, negative exponents and whole numbers and fractions. And we understood that the foundational skills were related to a 6th grade standard regarding expressions and exponents, particularly expanded form. We graded some student work and identified 3 students that needed remediation, students 1, 2, and 5. And you can see on the screen an example of one of those students who had the expanded form but was not doing the fraction and decimal multiplication correctly. So here's where we pick up today. At this point, you will want to open the Grade 8 Module 1 Topic A Remediation Tool that's linked in the webinar. And please turn to page 4, which you can see a screenshot of on my screen. And I'm going to give us a minute to read over this and click into that linked lesson, the 6th grade lesson 5, which is also uploaded into the webinar if that's easier for you to access that. So read this page 4 and then open up the 6th grade lesson, and we'll come back together in about 1 minute. As you saw when you read, there is the link that provides us the recommended remediation resource for this group of students that we've identified. And in addition to linking to the instructional material that we can use in the classroom, there's also guidance provided about the exact portions of the lesson that are recommended. So in this example, use the concept development portion of the lesson and a sampling of problems from the problem set focused on conceptual understanding. So here is where our work as teachers comes in after we've graded our work and separated our students into different groups. We're going to take a look at this lesson. So this is what you would have seen on the Engage New York website if you went through the hyperlink. It takes you to the grade 6 page and you would select lesson 5. Or you can find that linked in the webinar box. You may have found it that way as well. So we're going to take about 5 minutes for you to review this grade 6 lesson and thinking about the remediation guidance about using the concept development and a sampling of problems. I want you to decide which problems you would use if these were your students, given what we saw in the student work on Monday, that these students are not correctly using expanded form and or not doing the multiplication and decimal fraction and decimal multiplication correctly. So please take 5 minutes to review the 6th grade lesson, and then we'll come back together to share in the chat. Yes, that's a great note that's coming through the chat, that in the remediation document, it does call it concept development, and we know in the middle school Engage lessons, they have a different structure than the elementary lessons. So it is called classwork in here, but we're still looking for any part that addresses the underlying concept at hand. Thanks for clarifying that. At this point, if you haven't already, please start sharing some thoughts in the chat box about which portions you would definitely include in your remediation for the skills we identified in the student work for students that were struggling with the expanded notation. It's great to see so many different ideas coming through the chat, and all of these I think are getting at exactly what was called out that we're trying to get students to practice, which is going back to the concept behind expanded form and the connection with expressions and exponents. And I see a lot of people noting you don't need to teach the whole lesson. We can pull out specific parts. We can choose just ones with fractions or just decimals or just whole numbers based on what we saw in the student work. 2 other parts of the lesson that I feel like I would definitely emphasize as the teacher to really hit home the concept is I thought this question 4 that was at the bottom of page 56, one student thought 2 to the 3rd power was equal to 6. Anytime we see questions where students are identifying a mistake or explaining someone's reasoning or what was incorrect about someone's reasoning, really helps hit at that conceptual understanding again. So I was definitely going to include that, as well as an example where students are having to differentiate between x to the 4th or 4x, where they're having to understand the distinction between exponential notation versus multiplication, because we saw that confusion on the student work. So we want to make sure we gave them some opportunities, such as what I'm highlighting here on the screen, to understand the differences between those. So at this point, we've gone straight to those linked remediation resources, and we've selected a few parts, and it's going to differ based on what we saw in the work, how much of the lesson we would need to do based on the gap we'd identified. But I really, hats off to y'all in the chat, because I thought all the ideas that came through were really strong and would set students up to be successful in this module without losing a lot of instructional time going back to reteach so many foundational skills. So our next big decision point around timing is when are we going to do this? When during our module plan does this need to happen before we begin the module? Can this happen during the module as I pull small groups within my classroom? And when can it happen within our school day? Are you not seeing my PowerPoint? I'm going to give the webinar a second to load my PowerPoint to make sure that's coming through. All right, there we go. So again, our two big decision points, when within our unit plan and when within our school day. So in terms of within the module, the main decision, since these diagnostics are by topic, your decision as a teacher will be, does this remediation need to happen before I can start the topic, or can it be done within the topic? And so let's talk about that with this example. So we had 3 students within our small group of student work, and they sorted out into 2 different groups, as we saw. So we had one student, student 2, who had the correct expanded form, but they were not correctly doing the fraction and decimal multiplication. And then we had another group of students, students 1 and 5, who were incorrect on both pieces. They were incorrect on the expanded form, and they had incorrect multiplication. And that's what's got in the way of them passing the diagnostic. And if you'll remember, when we looked at page 4 during our last webinar, and when we reread it at the beginning of today, the most important look for called out was the student's ability to create expanded form of the expression. So as a teacher, when we're thinking about our groups of students, it's showing me student 2 would be ready to enter the module because they had that understanding of expanded form. I could start the grade level work in my class, and I could work with that student during a small group center time or at another point during the class to help them with their operations. Contrasting that to students 1 and 5, because they don't have the expanded form, they need that remediation before beginning the topic, or they are not as likely to be successful within the grade level work. So that's just, with this example, how I might think about that as a teacher, and that is going to be another area where teachers really have to make the decision for themselves in their class about whether the remediation stops instruction for one day before we begin, or maybe comes as a mini lesson before lesson 1, or if it's something that can be done alongside during the classroom while other students are doing the problem set or some sort of additional activity. I'm going to pause there to see if there are any questions that come through about how to decide timing within the module. All right. So the next big piece is, when is this going to happen within our school day? So it was really interesting to see what was shared during the warm-up about how different schools are structured and what RTI time or intervention time is available that we might be able to repurpose to use with these remediation tools. We're going to read 3 scenarios of how remediating unfinished learning could look in 3 different schools. So linked in the webinar is a document called Timing for Unfinished Learning. Let's take 3 minutes to read that, and as you're reading, please make note of which pieces might apply to your school context or provide some additional ideas about how remediation could occur. In the chat, if anyone is feeling like their school schedule, they just don't know how these can work, please be asking those questions, because we really believe these are a great new tool that are going to help students access the grade level material, but we know that pacing and timing is a real challenge, and so we can use this time to ask those questions and brainstorm among ourselves if we can about when this remediation might occur. All right, nothing's coming through the chat where anyone feels very concerned about when these can happen, so that's great. I'm glad that one of the school scenarios seemed to match what's happening at your school, and it did seem from what was shared in the warm-up that you do have time built into the school day, and now hopefully these materials can be a real asset to you during that time to save some time looking for instructional materials to use with students. The last piece that we're going to talk about today before we do some Q&A is about maximizing intervention time. So it seems like we have a mix of teachers on the call today, grade level teachers, special ed teachers, RTI teachers, and so many of us have different roles within intervention time, but based on our work with schools across the state, we've seen some best practices that really maximize that intervention time. So we want to think about those now and think about how you could strengthen intervention at your school. So I have a few called out on the screen. So first of all, we believe that intervention time should be standards aligned work, even if that's below grade level standards. So in the example we've just worked through, if this was taking place in intervention, 8th grade students would be working on a 6th grade standard, but it's really purposeful. It's directly aligned to what's happening in their 8th grade classroom, and it's supporting them to be successful in their grade level content. We want to make sure we're leaning towards that and moving away from skills that are generated off the cuff or just practicing, operations or other more like basic procedures. Although they're important, they may not be what's most important for the grade level content happening at that time. The second best practice is to have a communication plan between core math teachers and intervention teachers on your lesson plans and on your data. So some sort of regular routine where teachers can come together, share lesson plans, discuss strategies, and review data to make sure that all students are learning and problem solve together when we see data that's not where we want it to be. We also hope there's a process in place to assess the quality, alignment, and effectiveness of intervention programs. So many schools purchase either computer-based or textbook intervention programs, and we want to make sure that there is a rhythm to make sure those are working, to review student data that kids are improving and getting closer to grade level mastery through our use of intervention. And lastly, we want to make sure that all our intervention teachers can be included in any math PD. So I know some of the schools that I work with around New Orleans have all hands on deck approach to math intervention. So in the morning, students might have math, a small math group with all teachers across the school. So that might mean the math intervention is coming from an ELA teacher or a PE teacher. So we want to make sure that we can include in all intervention teachers in PD and development opportunities so that they are aware of the strategies being used in the core math class and can reinforce those with their intervention groups. See a few questions coming through the chat, so keep those coming and we'll make sure to answer those and clarify, because this is definitely a piece that I know can prompt a lot of reflection. While you continue to ask questions in the chat, and we'll come back together and answer some of those, let's take 5 minutes to review another document that I've uploaded into the webinar. It's called Common Missteps in Math Remediation. I'm going to give you a few minutes to read that, and then we can share reactions in the chat or questions you have about common missteps and our recommendation to strengthen intervention.
Hi, this is Madeline from the Achievement Network. I wanted to jump in. I think Catherine put a great question in the chat specifically around spending intervention time working on operations and basic facts. And I think that that connects to one of the missteps that's addressed on the screen. We know, I think all of us having been math teachers know how frustrating it is when students are lacking those operational skills and basic computation. But a common challenge that we see is spending all of an intervention time on procedural facts. And I think one thing that the tool can really provide here is connecting to the right aspect of rigor. So in many cases, what students may need to make progress with the foundational skills or unfinished learning that they have may actually be conceptual. And so this may link to those prior grade level lessons that actually better fill those gaps than I know some of the things that I used to do, which was a lot of computational practice to try to catch kids up.
And I think we all know that it's a both and. You need to be doing both at once. And so I could see in this example that we've been working with, you have your 5 to 10 minutes fluency drill at the beginning of your intervention period where you're working on basic skills and operations you've identified, and then you make sure you're moving into providing the 6th grade conceptual development that's going to support them in their class. So having a balance of both is certainly important. If you have finished reading the document titled Common Missteps in Math Remediation, if you'll please share in the chat like something it's making you think about related to either intervention you provide or something at your school that you want to go back and think about and potentially provide a recommendation for change to make sure intervention is really effective for students. A lot of good reflections coming through the chat box and areas that schools have already been making improvements on to make sure intervention is really effective. One reason that we feel so excited about the Louisiana Department of Education Eureka Remediation Tools is how they do address so many of these common missteps. And so the few that I've called out on the screen are just a few examples of that. And so, as one participant called out, oftentimes we do halt instruction for a broad review. I know oftentimes at the beginning of the year, teachers feel a need to go back and review concepts from the prior year to make sure students remember them over the summer and have what they need. Using these diagnostics can perform the same function, but we make sure that we're providing it right when we need it. So students are having that reminder and refresher on the prior grade level skills right before they're about to use them in the module, which is really going to make sure they have what they need. It's helping us prioritize the essential skills. There's definitely not time to go back and reteach everything from the prior grade level. And so the diagnostic helps us zone in on which standards from prior grades are the most important for this new content. These provide the opportunity to connect intervention and grade level math work. I know oftentimes when I was teaching math, what was going on in intervention was disconnected from what was going on in my classroom, and especially for students who are behind, that can feel really confusing and make it feel like math is just this random assortment of skills instead of concepts that do connect and build over time. And as Madeline noted earlier when we were talking about aspect of rigor, the linked lessons give us a great start to reteaching tied to that correct aspect of rigor, whether it's conceptual, procedural, or application, to ensure students are getting the unfinished learning filled in the way that's going to help them be most successful now. So to recap, here is the process that we've used, and as you go back and you begin using these tools at your school, this is the process that you'll use in your classroom, and for many of you who are redelivering this to other teachers, that we would recommend they use as well. So we're going to diagnose using the provided diagnostics, and we're going to grade that work to determine which gaps exist and create groups of students. Then we're going to make sure that we understand how the prerequisite standard relates to the new content and decide whether that's a gap that needs to be addressed before beginning the topic or if we could do it during instruction. And the last thing is we're going to take action. So if it's our whole class, we're going to build in scaffolds to lessons, or we're going to adjust our calendar to add in an additional lesson. And if it's small group, we're going to coordinate with intervention teachers, or we're going to use other time during the day or in centers to provide that differentiated instruction. As we wrap up today, we wanted to address a few questions that had come up on webinar 1, and please share in the chat if there's anything else that is on your mind now as you're thinking about using these back at your school. So the first question that came in was when to administer the diagnostics. In this example we looked at, the diagnostic was very short. It was just 3 questions aligned to the 6th grade standard. Some of the diagnostics can get fairly lengthy. They can be parts A through F with 3 questions on each one. And so in that instance, our recommendation would be to spread them out over the course of several days, maybe along with your exit ticket or with your bell ringer. So you could assign just 3 to 6 questions each day for students, so it wasn't taking as much instructional time, and then that would still give you time to grade them before beginning the next topic. Another question about exactly who is the resource designed for, and so we just want to reiterate, we're hoping that grade level teachers, special education teachers, intervention teachers, RTI, that this is a resource that is used by anyone that is providing math instruction to students, and is an opportunity to collaborate between teachers. So it is designed for small group or whole group lessons. We did have a question on Monday about whether CLUs are provided for attending this webinar series, and I did ask the state about that, and the response is that CLUs are awarded by the district, and so you would need to contact a district administrator to find out if your district is providing CLUs for these webinars. And then materials from today. I'm so glad that everyone wants all the materials, so you can take these back and make sure many more teachers get access to this information. So before I log off, I am going to upload my PowerPoint to the webinar, so you can just download it straight from there, and that will make sure everyone can have it that needs it. I'm going to wait a few seconds to see if any more questions come through the chat before we wrap up. All right, I've just uploaded the PowerPoint into the webinar from today, and for the question that came in about the first webinar materials, yes, I can upload the first webinar materials as well, and I will be doing a re-recording of webinar 1 that occurred on Monday, and it will be posted to the state's YouTube channel so that that can be watched. My contact information is on the screen as well, so please feel free to email me if you need anything or if you have additional questions, because we really want to make sure that these tools are getting into the hands of teachers to support students, and are happy to support in the future if questions are coming up. So let's close by please sharing just one commitment you have to how you're going to use the Eureka remediation tools at your school. So many great commitments being shared in the chat. I'm excited for you to take these and for the impact these are going to have on students in our schools. Thanks so much for joining us today, and I'll stay on in case any additional questions come through. Thanks, everyone.
This has been a presentation of the Louisiana Department of Education, copyright 2017, all rights reserved. For more information or to contact the Louisiana Department of Education on the web, go to www.louisianabelieves.com or call 1-877-453-2721.